Welcome back to another episode of Prime and Load. We have an exciting episode today as we ring in the anniversary of the creation of the Continental Army in 1775. And so we've brought on a historian who focuses on the Continental Army in his research in order to sort of best explain this for our listeners. I have the pleasure today of introducing the historian to you. His name is John Rees. John is the sort of historian that when you look out at sort of the field of different people doing historical work and research, it's incredibly encouraging to see people like John, because as a professional historian, someone who works at a college with a PhD, often when you're at conferences or conventions or something like this, people will come up to you, or you'll be talking to a little old lady, and she'll say, "Oh, my husband is a historian too." And by that she means he's very interested in military history. He reads a lot, maybe probably on World War II, and is engaged with the past in that way, and that's a wonderful thing. And frequently, academic historians, who are sometimes kind of pompous asses, can hear that statement and say, "Oh man, that guy's not really a historian. He didn't get a PhD. He's not a professor. Like, what's he doing?" But John is a phenomenal example of someone who kind of bridges this world. He's not a historian who has professional academic credentials, but he's someone who, whenever I hear him talk, I learn new things about the Continental Army. He's someone, whenever I see him at a reenacting event, I always want to go and talk to him, because I always have questions that I know he's going to answer. And so John is someone who has spent his whole life researching this sort of period of military history. He's someone who kind of marries this to reenacting, to sort of the demands of a career outside the academic world, and he does this in a really rigorous and admirable way. And so we're really, really excited to have John Rees on with us today. Thanks so much for being here, John.
Well, thank you, and you're going to make me blush.
That's the whole goal. That's the whole goal. So, John, can you tell us? You work for the United States government in your day job. What got you into history? Has it been a lifelong passion? Is it something that, like, you were a kid reading about George Washington and it kind of grew from there? What drew you to this deep interest that you have in this part of the American past?
Well, part of it is I've always been an avid reader, as soon as I could read. Part of it was that my brother got all the cool stuff, so he got all the cool history books. I mean, he was an older brother, so he got all the cool soldier sets and all those things. So it's probably like an aspirational thing too. But he was interested in history too. But I remember taking his soldiers and Civil War soldiers and whatever else was available, and Alamo soldiers, and trying to recreate the Battle of Waterloo with them. Probably when I was 8 or 9 years old. But I always loved history, and I in my probably by the time I was in middle school, a little before, I was interested in World War II. Really interested. Reading a lot about it, and I went to different time periods, Napoleonics, and then I went to the Civil War. And I've always been interested in revolution and written a little, read about it here and there. But it wasn't until I joined Living History Reenactment Pastime in 1984. And I finally found a reason to research, and from that I found a reason to write, because there are a lot of questions. It started out with questions about the units we were portraying, and nobody could really tell me about them. They could tell me bits and pieces about them. Sometimes they could tell me very little at all. So I started out researching the units I was with. First was the 5th Pennsylvania Battalion, and we were actually doing the 6th Pennsylvania Regiment, but the 5th Pennsylvania Battalion was the precursor, 1-year unit. And then the next, I joined the 2nd New Jersey, so I was researching in depth the 2nd New Jersey, and just feeling my way, because I was an avid reader, but I just read the way, I mean, I guess I wrote what seemed most natural to me, which was not the best writing, but it was okay. But as I researched, I came across all kinds of great information other than about those units, food, women with the Army, the things they carried, the things they wore, and had the I had the forethought to just set that stuff aside, copy it and set it aside, and then eventually I got enough to do articles, or at least have a base that I could research more on, and then do articles on those subjects. So, and then later on in the '90s, I had great mentors like Holly Mayer and Don Hagest, and a friend of mine, Sandra Oliver, who did a food history newsletter, who helped me with my writing and my the way I wrote my papers. And I mean, one of the things I remember, Don Hagest did it too, but Holly Mayer really redlined my papers, and I wasn't upset at that. It was a compliment, and it helped me a lot. And Sandra Oliver got me out of a passive voice into writing with an active voice, which makes the writing more compelling. I mean, it can't save your writing, but it does help the writing. So it's been an experience, and a great experience the whole way through, really.
So you've been reenacting, and this is not an effort to make you feel old, longer than I've been alive. How was reenacting in the 1980s compared to now? I mean, you're just coming out of the bicentennial in 1984, right? And so how has the landscape changed? How is reenacting the Continental Army in 1984 different than reenacting it in 2024 or 2025?
I think, well, actually, to digress a little bit, I just did the Fort Ty event, and I told a couple of the young guys there that the shirts I was wearing and carrying were definitely older than they were. One of the things was that in one way, people thought the hobby was over. The Revolutionary War aspect of the hobby was over, because the bicentennial was over, the interest was gone. There was going to be some aspect of the hobby that would survive, but the high times were gone. And maybe in some ways with numbers that could be true, but with quality, we're doing so much more with quality and with information now. And that's another thing too. I think a lot of people thought that by the late '80s, all the research was there. It was as much as we could find it. It was there, so we had to use what we had. And then, of course, that was put to was made a lie, because I mean, just in the last 10 years, so much has come out. Not let alone from the late '80s until now, until 2000. It was hard to get clothing. Little things like camp kettles were pretty much unavailable. There was so much, and there were units you looked up to, and other ones who were aspirational and tried to do very well, but it was really hard to do a really good impression unless you were manufacturing things in unit. But a lot of the information on clothing is definitely not as good as it is today, and probably not as good as it was 10 years ago. For me, it was a great time to get into the hobby, because there were some interesting things going on. People were starting to do some really interesting things post bicentennial, and they didn't necessarily play to the public. Things like tacticals, things like some other events that were going on, just almost as a learning experience for the participants, which was interesting.
So before we go on and talk about the creation of the Continental Army, I'd just like to highlight something that John just said for the listeners, because I think it's as applicable in the world of living history and popular history as it is for academic historians. What he just said was, man, there were some people who thought in the late '80s we had it all figured out, and you have your impression built. You've done what you've done, and you say, I've done enough. And what makes John unique as a historian, and what makes other academic historians like Christopher Duffy unique as writers, is that they go back through and say, "Man, let me make sure I've got that right. Man, let me make sure that I'm doing this to the best of my ability. That I've continually tried to improve. Whether I'm writing a book, whether I'm working on a regimental code and its design." It's this desire for continual improvement that sets apart not just progressive reenactors, but sets apart really great historians. I mean, if you read Christopher Duffy's writings on the Prussian army in the 1970s and compare that to what he was writing just before he died, he's saying very, very different things. And what makes him, in my mind, stand apart from the other field of historians who wrote their lecture notes in 1985 and are still giving those same lecture notes is a continual willingness to look at new sources and reevaluate what those sources mean about the interpretation of this period of history. John, it's so great to have you on. Let's talk a little bit about the Continental Army.
So, John, when we start talking about the Continental Army, obviously the Continental Army is founded in 1775, but this is not the first experience Americans have in the military. Can you kind of speak to what military experiences do these colonists have before the creation of the Army?
Well, the most recent and probably the most important experience, of course, was the 7 Years' War in America, or the French and Indian War, because there were a lot of the British Army learned a lot of lessons during that war, and and I'm not to say that there weren't lessons learned on the continent from Eastern Europe that were brought into the armies of France and Britain, but the French and Indian War really laid in lessons of how to fight, in a forested or an area where it was definitely not, the roads were not that good. You did come into areas where it was easy to be ambuscaded. Solid formations were not necessarily the best thing to do. You had to be flexible. You really had to be flexible, and that, well, first of all, it helped the British Army in America during the Revolution, to say the least. But it also affected how the American Army fought. And of course, some of the commanders, I have no idea what the numbers are, but some commanders, especially the early commanders, had French and Indian War experiences. I mean, of course, look at somebody like Daniel Morgan. I mean, his French and Indian War experiences, at least early on, were, of course, as a wagoner on the Duquesne expedition, 1755, the disastrous expedition. So he learned a lot, probably just by observing and seeing what happened. Other commanders, Israel Putnam, was very involved, and at least some of the enlisted men at the very beginning, because you're looking at the early army was based on militias. So you're taking men 16 to 60, 55 to 60. So some of those older men had French and Indian War experience. So at least they had experience in the field, and they also had experience probably in some tactics too. And you can also, then you can also add the Cherokee warfare too, and other Indian warfare, but which some was during the war, some was part of the conflict, but was somewhat separate too, especially like Dunmore's War. So you had Virginia commanders and other Southern commanders had experiences in those wars too, which again was invaluable experience. It really was.
Do you think it's possible to kind of glean how those experiences transferred over into their effectiveness as officers? I don't know if there's any way to really capture that, but do you see people that had more active roles in one conflict are turning out more effective in the next conflict?
There are probably some regimental officers that I can't think of right off the top of my head, but the one that does really stand out, and it's a man who didn't have a huge military role in the French and Indian War, and that's Daniel Morgan. I mean, he started out as a regimental commander, and then eventually commanded his rifle corps. And he had illness during the war. He had some problems with illness and with infirmities that affected him even during the war. But when he went south, he came into his own. And even if it's only the one victory, the victory at Cowpens, I mean, it was such a tiny battle, but it had such far-reaching results. It was a very small army followed by another relatively small army, but it was it was his tactical experience along with a little bit of luck, but that luck was also based on Continental Army training in those regiments at that battle. So that's the one man that I can really point to. Other men like Israel Putnam were not as effective. They were older. They weren't in the prime of the years. I think by and large, a lot of the older officers, they had knowledge, but they weren't the best commanders in the field because of their age. Some of the other commanders, probably regimental commanders, probably performed best, and maybe some of those might have been in Virginia and possibly even Pennsylvania too. But yeah, see that, and the thing is, that would be a great study. That'd be a great article, or possibly even a book to look at the men who participated as officers, general officers, field officers, and see what their experience was, and see what they did in the Revolution, and how that previous war taught them.
You talked a little bit about that militia system that existed prior to the Continental Army. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of speak to that a little bit? How did that organization set up the army that would come in the future?
Well, because there are 13 colonies, so there are differences between the colonies, but basically, men 16 to 60, about 60 years old, were basically, they had to sign up for militia service. And the way it worked during the war, previous to war, they would have had training days probably a couple times a year. So their training was not that in depth, but they had knowledge of weapons, and they had, more importantly, they had a group of men that they could form into a larger body of militia, and that would possibly in time of emergency serve for a longer period. And of course, during that period, they would gain more experience and gain more training too. But if you look at what happened at Lexington and Concord, and granted, Massachusetts knew that something was going to happen. They didn't know what was going to happen, and they started training more intensively their militia during those preceding months. So the militia at Concord and Lexington and those surrounding operations were relatively well trained. For militia, they were pretty well trained, and it showed that day. Now, of course, their training is not the only reason that the British received the bloody nose that day. There are a lot of different factors. I think the British overreached in one way, but the response by the Massachusetts militia was a large factor. It really was.
And I think typically when we think about American militia, we often think about Massachusetts Minutemen, but like you're saying, there's militias are an organization across all the colonies. Are there major differences between each colony in either their training or what they're doing or how they're organized or anything like that?
They were by and large relatively the same. The one standout that I can think of is, of course, is Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania was a Quaker-run state. It was, and they didn't have a standing militia. So what they had were voluntary associations, because the citizens of Pennsylvania knew that they needed a defense, and they found that the hard way during the French and Indian War, and also some of the previous conflicts. So they instead of a state authorized militia, you had basically county and town and city organizations, and instead of every man 16 to 60 serving, they were voluntary, and they were associations. The militia or the volunteers were called associators, and they did some pretty stellar service during the Trenton-Princeton campaign, especially at Princeton in 77. But and then finally in 1777, the state of Pennsylvania starts. They pass a militia law and start this. So finally, the state of Pennsylvania has a militia, with where every man is, in that age range was liable to serve.
And it's these militias who are fighting those early engagements, and they're the ones that are all around Boston, correct? During the actual siege of the city, right? When Gage is in the city.
Yeah. Now those of course were New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts militia, because it was at first the army was a New England army. And actually, we're coming up on June 14th, which is the birthday of the American Army. It's not exactly. You could pick several dates when the American Army was formed. In October 7th, 1774, Massachusetts decided to gather supplies. Well, they standardized the company sizes and the regimental sizes. But they also authorized the collecting of supplies for an army not less than 20,000 men. That's October 1774. So that's 7 months before Lexington and Concord. And then the evening of Lexington and Concord, those militia units followed the British back into Boston and began building that cordon around the city. Now some militia went home and then came back. Some of those units that didn't make the fight just stayed. And by May, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress realized that they had a real problem on their hand, because with an army growing and growing and growing, they had to support it somehow. And they were just one colony. So on May 16, 1775, that's when they wrote Continental Congress asking them to take over the army. So that's a little less than a month before the Continental Congress on June 14th, 1775, authorized sending the rifle companies up to reinforce the army, and that was the first quote unquote Southern contingent to join the Northern Army, and that's when it finally became a truly Continental Army.
And was there any talk about creating a standing army before that request? That's one of the things. There's not been a lot written about this, and one of the best books right now, and I know he's revising it right now, is Robert Wright's The Continental Army, and I didn't get a chance to read through it again, but there had to have been discussion in the Continental Congress about, especially after the events at Lexington and Concord, and I'm sure it wasn't much of a surprise when Massachusetts asked them to take over the army, because it was only a month before they authorized reinforcements from the South. But I don't know the details of it, really.
If I could chip in with a very basic question from a very ignorant Brit, I always make the caveat that this is not a war that I know a vast amount, and I know even less about the other side. We're speaking of a Continental Army, we're speaking of a Continental Congress. That's quite a bold claim when you consider the 13 colonies relative to the North America as a whole. I mean, is that the point? They're laying claim to the whole lot, or where does the name actually come from in this sense?
Well, at this point, they hadn't declared independence. This was a very large protest. I mean, it was basically set off by British actions, and having just been involved with the Fort Ticonderoga event. The events of 19 April 1775 were huge. I mean, they waited until the British fired the first shots, because at Concord, the militia company on the hill basically stood by and watched the British march past over Concord Bridge, march about another mile or so to look for cannon that they'd heard were there, and then watched them march back across the bridge and take position on the other side. They didn't fire because they knew it was an act that they weren't going to be able to take back, especially if they fired first. But any kind of action that day, because they really didn't know about Lexington Green that early on in the day. So it finally, what finally happened was, they posted on the other side of the bridge, and there were accidental shots, and for as far as we know, they were on the British side, and that set off the firing at Concord Bridge. It wasn't until the movements against Fort Ticonderoga, Crown Point, Skenesboro, New York, that's when they actually took a fortification held by Crown troops, basically without being fired upon, with no other actions against them. They just decided to take those fortifications because they knew they were strategic. They knew that they had to hold them if they were going to control the territory. So, it's, saying that you're a Continental Congress. Well, the Continental Congress predated the war pretty much. But then it was basically a way to get redress from the Crown. It wasn't until post, April 19, 1775 that they realized that they had to support an army.
I suppose what I was asking as well, though, John, I mean, it could be, let's say, the Patriot Army, the American Army, the Patriot Congress, the American Congress. It's the use of Continental. Seems a little. It seems a little odd to me. It's 13 colonies squeezed up along the seaboard, and leaving Canada out of the equation. There's quite a lot of America that isn't the 13 colonies at this point.
If I could jump in for a second, I just want to check my notes here.
Sure.
The British host is saying that we're ambitious and laying claims to things that we don't actually occupy. Is that what's going on here? Just checking. Just checking.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean,
right. Okay. Maybe we're a little ambitious.
Well,
we would dearly have liked to take Canada. We didn't quite get it. Give us some time. We'll get there. We promise.
Yeah, I mean, and the Continental Claim. Well, first of all, the Continental Claim comes about because it's not even a claim. It's a way of joining the British colonies together, because they were separate entities. They really weren't used to forming together to do anything. So having a quote unquote Continental Congress was a way to have an identity for those 13 separate colonies. Plus, the separate colonies, basically, they most or all of them claimed from their western border all the way to the Pacific Ocean. I mean, I know Connecticut did that. I know Virginia did that. So, in some ways, they were very ambitious. Perhaps not as ambitious as Britain, but yes, very ambitious.
So we have this army that's formed, and can you kind of describe the makeup of this early stage Continental Army? In the past, we've talked about 18th century armies kind of having three components, an infantry, artillery, and cavalry component to them. Could you kind of describe the makeup in this new American Army context?
Well, in 1775 and even 1776, in 1775, the cavalry component of the army was pretty much non-existent. In 1776, it was a little bit larger, but still pretty much non-existent. The artillery, you had a nascent artillery coming into being, but basically artillery companies. It really didn't gain a large boost until the cannon from Ticonderoga were brought east, so they could actually invest Boston, or lay siege to Boston with a large artillery component. Now, a lot of that artillery was not necessarily good for the field. So it was great for a siege, but not good for a field, because you had to have field carriages for a moving army. So the 1775 artillery component began small and basically was very, very. It was suited to the siege around Boston, but not yet to a field campaign. And until late July, August 1775, when the rifle companies from Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania reached the Boston Army, the Army of Observation, they were all New Englanders, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. That was a component of the army. So, it wasn't until the authorization in June 14th, but in actuality, not until they actually joined the army that it became a truly Continental Army. But you still didn't have representation from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina troops never served in the North, and actually one Georgia battalion did serve briefly in the North because they came north to recruit, but they were quickly sent back down because of really poor behavior. And that's a story in its own. That's pretty interesting. But and then of course, then in 1775 you have the New Yorkers forming 4 regiments. So bit by bit, and then it wasn't really until until November, the autumn of 1775, when you really start having the southern states starting to form their own battalions. I think Virginia was a little bit before that, before the autumn of 1775, but the autumn of 1775 was the real ramp up when and I can't say states, they were colonies, they were still provinces then, started to form their own military contingents. And they were voluntary. Unlike the militia, they weren't drafted out of the population. They were voluntary organizations. So it took a while to ramp up, and that's why there's an interesting difference between 1775 and early 1776, when they were still investing in Boston, when they finally went into large scale field operations in the summer of 1776. Now, of course, before that, you had operations against Quebec. Well, Montreal, the island, the forts along the St. Lawrence, Lake Champlain, and they finally reached Quebec, and then they of course had the you can't really call it a two-pronged assault, but it's you had Arnold's force coming up through Maine to reinforce the troops at Quebec. So those were the first field operations, really. They definitely had their problems. And I think there was an article, I think just in the Smithsonian, that my friend Jim Taub contributed to, and they said, well, the worst thing, if you wanted to bring the Canadians over to your side, the worst thing you could have done was to invade them, because it's a pretty pretty aggressive act, and but that's neither here nor there right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly in terms of the structure, John, but even just in terms of the two armies as a whole, maybe the backgrounds of the men in these armies, what are some of the differences between the Continental Army and the British Army in 1775 and 1776? I mean, are these men similar ages? Are they coming from similar backgrounds? Like, what makes these two armies similar? What makes them different?
They were. You really can't say they're an army of yeomen, but because there was a mix through both armies. You had men from towns. Some may have been apprentices, may have had skills, but decided to enlist for. You had the same thing in the American Army. The American Army was a little bit different because in 1775 and also 76 you had the Rege Militaire, where in the American Army they were defending their homes. Everybody wanted to join, and of course as in any war, the fighting was going to be over by Christmas, so or maybe the next Christmas. So everybody wanted to join, and they didn't want to miss what was going to happen. You did not quite have that with the British Army because they were standing regiments. They were taken out of Wellington, of course, is famous for having called the British Army in the Napoleonic Wars, the scum of the earth, even though that's an outtake from a larger quote. But they probably were from some of the poorer classes or people, down on their luck. So there's a difference right there. You had somebody like Joseph Plum Martin who started in the state regiments in Connecticut, and then joined like the year after joined the Continental Connecticut Regiment, and I think he was 16 years old. He basically ran away and joined without his family knowing, because again it was exciting. It was what your neighbors were doing, and there was a threat against your home.
So the image that's often presented, and I want to get your take on it, John, is that in terms of the social composition of these two armies, at the beginning of the war, the American army looks a little different. It looks like maybe the virtuous citizen soldier volunteer going out to protect liberty. But by the time we get to 77 and 78 and on, it starts to look a little bit more like the British Army in terms of it's the guys who need clothing and need food who are signing up to fight in the American Army for material benefits, in much the same way that guys over maybe in Britain who are out of work weavers or out of work day laborers are signing up for the British Army. Do you think, I mean, again, I'm kind of paraphrasing Martin and Lender here, but do you think broadly that's a pretty accurate picture? Do you I mean, is it just one Continental Army? Can we speak of, is the Continental Army remade every year? I mean, how does the army change as the war goes on?
Well, see, it is pretty much remade every year, and one of the reasons is, when you're talking about where the men are coming from and what their reasons for joining are, you probably still had some, quote unquote patriotism, on the Whig side, on the Continental side. But yeah, the men who served in 1775 and 1776, some of them left. But then again, there was also a lot of crossover. There was a good number of men who served in 1775 right through to, and through those 1775 and 76 were both years with 1 year enlistments. So, you signed up at the beginning of the year, or in 1775, you joined the Army in May, served to the end of the year, re-enlisted if you wanted to, served another year. And it wasn't until 1777 that they finally decided that long-term enlistments, either for 3 years of the war, or for during the war. And most of those enlistments were for during the war. There were a number that were for 3 years. But by 1777, you had a core of veterans, probably mostly young guys, a few older guys. By 1777, it wasn't unusual to see some men in the regiments that were in their 50s, and it was a small number, yes, but they were there. The core age group was probably from maybe like 20 in the American Army. The Continental Army was probably like from 20 to 25, and of course you had younger guys too. And of course that changed as the war went on. Another reason the Continental Army changed as the war went on is, for my first book, which dealt with black soldiers' experiences and a lot of pension papers. When you go through pension papers, the men say, I served with such and such a regiment. Well, actually, what they did is they served with several regiments, and sometimes they served in the same company, but that company was absorbed by another regiment, and sometimes it joined another company. So in the Pennsylvania line, in 1776, you had, I think it was 6 battalions. By 1777, you had 13 battalions or regiments. Eventually, it went back down to 11 in 1778. I think by 1781, it went down to 6 regiments. And then those regiments didn't even serve in the field, because in 1781, they served in the field in provisional regiments, or provisional battalions. So the actual regimental depots stayed home, and you had the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Pennsylvania Battalion with men from all those 6 regiments in those battalions and officers. And then by after Green Spring in 1781, they went down to 2 battalions, provisional battalions, because the losses were so great. And then the 3rd Battalion came back, was recruited, and came back in fall of 1781, just after the siege of Yorktown. And by 1783, the 1st Pennsylvania, they created the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment in South Carolina from the remains of those provisional battalions. And they were stationed on James Island, South Carolina from January 1st, 1783 until they returned home that June. So, and that goes with, you don't see the provisional battalions like that with all the other states, but they start with a certain number of regiments, and they wean down, and of course the men are consolidated into those later units. And then of course you have things like the siege of Charleston, which destroyed the South Carolina line, pretty much the North Carolina line, and the Virginia line. So then they had to take a core of veterans and start anew with the regiments for 1781 to 1783. So yeah, the Continental Army was it was constantly changing, and we're not even talking about the drafting men for the armies, which was done at some point in pretty much every state during the war, for different periods from 4 months. From Yeah, from 6 months to 8 months to 9 months to 18 months. And 18 months, the drafts were mostly later in the war. So the 3rd Pennsylvania Battalion that finally rejoined the Army after the siege of Yorktown was made up of 18 months drafts, as opposed to the long-term, the newly enlisted long-term soldiers after the Pennsylvania Mutiny, and the other 2 battalions. Yeah, it's a complicated subject.
Quite a lot of those issues, John. I'm thinking, you're talking about short-term enlistments, units being consolidated, men being sort of mixed up and things. You even mentioned a mutiny, which kind of leads into the question. They all sound like symptoms for morale problems to me, thinking more generally. I mean, was that an issue for the Continentals?
Oh yeah, there were a number of mutinies during the war. I mean, I have a whole book by John Nagy. It's just all about the mutinies. I mean, I have no idea how many there were. Some are pretty large, but probably the largest and most successful was the Pennsylvania Mutiny in 1781, because some of those men, actually, the officers wrote that some of those men had served since 1775. They came up with the rifle companies and had never formally enlisted. So they served from 1775 to 1780, early 1781, and they never actually signed enlistment papers. They just served. And it was successful because they basically dissolved the Pennsylvania line. They discharged all the men, and then they re-enlisted the men who wanted to re-enlist. And a large portion did re-enlist. Some men didn't. So yeah, there were constantly, but more likely it's not organizational problems that caused the mutinies. It was more problems with food, with clothing, with pay. Those were the huge issues that caused mutinies. Because usually when you consolidate a regiment, you take 2 regiments and consolidate it to win one. Those men that served together for the longest period, they pretty much stayed together. They tried to keep companies together, or like if you melded a company into another company, they tried to keep those men together in the new company. So, and that's probably one of the most important components in any army, when you have those mostly mess squads, but sometimes it's larger, of men who served together for a long time, for a number of years. So that did happen, where they were largely kept together, but then new men were coming in.
So John, it kind of sounds like you're telling us the Continental Army is unique and not unique in different ways. One way that is similar to all armies is it's not just sort of a force organization chart on paper. It's being really affected by real events in the real world, and those events are having knock-on effects as this organization's trying to fight the war going on. But the other way the Continental Army is perhaps different, and maybe, I mean, you said the word in the context of battalions, more provisional than other European armies, is it doesn't have long-standing traditions and power structures in place when the war begins. It's sort of a force that's reacting to real events, but also being created out of whole cloth on the fly in the midst of a war. Would you say that's fairly accurate?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's interesting because in 1781, I mean, yeah, the Pennsylvania Provisional Battalions go from 1781 and serve till the end of 1782, when they're finally formed into a single regiment, a standing regiment. But those provisional battalions were used mostly in the light infantry. When you brought the light companies out, so they, you finally by 1778, by summer 1778, especially by fall or spring of 1779, you finally had an army with one manual of exercise, one military manual, as opposed to before 1778. Everybody was using different manuals. A lot of them were using 1764, but they were training their men different ways. Sometimes the training was done regimentally. Sometimes they got together a brigade and had brigade exercises. So that standard system allowed the 1778 light infantry provisional battalions to serve much more effectively, because they were all, to put it crudely, they were all on the same page. And when those Pennsylvania provisional battalions were serving under Lafayette in Virginia, there were 3 light infantry provisional battalions that had gone south first with Lafayette, and they were light infantry, but they were serving also as line soldiers too. But they were from men from from Connecticut and from New Jersey in the same battalion, men from Massachusetts and Connecticut in the same battalion. So you had men from all different states in one battalion, and they were able to maneuver effectively and basically work together.
So, just to kind of ask you all a question that I say to my students each semester, Steuben is the mascot of my university here in Steubenville. Is the gift that Baron de Steuben gives us not so much, he's not teaching the American Army how to fight, but instead he's standardizing the American Army and ensure that different components can work well together? Is that sort of what's going on in the Valley Forge Winter?
Yeah, I mean, at its simplest, he's giving them standard marching rates. So when they're marching from one place to another, they have a standard marching rate, especially under command. But he's also giving them standard ways to form from line to column, column to line, and how to have winter in a column. How different marching rates if you're trying to under command trying to go from one place to another quickly. So yeah, before that, there's an account of 1777 at Short Hills, which is really interesting because it's you can see how untrained the men are, but it also relates to what I think was Marshall found in his studies, that with like men when they're under fire, they tend to group together. In this account, at Short Hills, I think there were one division attacked by the British Army, and at one point the officer wrote the men clumped together. So they were doing what human beings do, but it also shows that they probably weren't very well trained either, because training takes that tendency out of you. So yeah, it's Steuben was the man, right place, right time. Washington knew he wanted to retrain the army, but he actually thought of Conway, Thomas Conway, for the Inspector General. And he would not have fit the bill. He was too political, too much of a troublemaker. He wouldn't have been able to do it. But Steuben was an amazing contribution. It really was.
The one thing that I've always understood was that one of the big contributions that Steuben also gave was creating the NCO Corps of the Army. Is that true, or is that a kind of a fabrication?
Well, when his manual finally came out in 1779, he basically put the roles of NCOs. So he basically set out what the roles were to do, what corporals were supposed to do, what sergeants were supposed to do. So in that way, he did, yeah. I think, again, it wasn't standardized. So by 1777, especially if sergeants, if NCOs or the NCOs had been serving since 1776 or 75 or 76, they were pretty experienced. So they were able to take care of the men under them, but they didn't always know what their exact duties were, unless they had men with experience, officers with experience above them, telling them what they needed to do as an NCO. But yeah, once finally, again, that's another standardization. Yeah.
Did this NCO Corps take on kind of a mirror image of the British or the European style, or was there something different about an American NCO Corps?
Well, and I haven't studied this exactly, but from what I understand is that American officers gave their orders directly to their men, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but I've read in the past that basically there was that they went through their NCOs in the British Army. Again, I'm not sure if that's quite true. There are other things in Charles Royster's Continental or Revolutionary Pre-Built War. There are other small things with discipline, because in 1777 there was an occasion of a private calling a Continental sergeant a chuckle-headed son of a bitch. Whereas after Steuben, they would have said, "Damn your orders, sir." I mean, they still would have been insubordinate, but it's the small things that mean a lot.
I might have to keep that comeback in my back pocket. because I think that's wonderful. So this army is created in 1775. When it is formally created, it's already in and around Boston.
Yes. Yep.
So if we say that is kind of operation number 0, what would be operation number 1? Whether it's a combat operations or logistics operations, something. What's the first operation that this new Continental Army undertakes?
Well, the first formal operation of the Army, because there were some operations going through all the colonies in larger, smaller, larger modes. Probably most of those really didn't occur till probably early 1776, some in 75. But the first large operation that the Continental Army went on in the field was the Canadian expedition. I mean, because you can't the operations to capture Ticonderoga, Crown Point, they were basically instituted by Massachusetts, Connecticut, but and also by the New Hampshire grants, which later became Vermont. But yeah, the Canadian expedition. Now the New York forces basically instigated it, but the Continental Army comes into play when they send Benedict Arnold's forces up through Quebec or up through Maine to reinforce the New York forces in Quebec, and then of course that eventually led to losses in defeat at the siege at the Battle of Quebec on January 1st, 1776. I guess December 31st, 1775, when they failed to take the town. Then they had to retreat. They were constantly pushed back by the British Army after that, and that eventually led to the Army taking post at Fort Ty, and eventually the operations at Saratoga. The Saratoga campaign. But Quebec, Canada was the first Continental Army field operation.
Are there any instances in that operation of some of the growing pains that we've talked about?
Well, one thing was basically just supply, clothing supply, food supply. I mean, they were getting. I think probably they were getting most of their food locally. They were using captured British clothing during the Quebec operations. But yeah, supply was really horrible during the Quebec siege and ensuing retreats.
So does that mean that the American Army on their first field expedition, if they're wearing British uniforms, are these American soldiers now wearing red in their first time out and about?
Some were. Well, maybe not. Maybe not in the first time, but to replace the clothing that had basically destroyed in use. Yeah, they were wearing some British coats. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and breeches and yeah.
Dang.
But then again, the American Army more or less used British clothing, captured clothing, pretty much at least till into 1782, when a portion of the Army, I think New Jersey, Massachusetts, I think New York too, were wearing captured British uniforms that had been dyed brown, taken apart, everything taken off, dyed brown, and then put all back together. But even then, I think there was one unit I think that was actually still just wore the red coats, and I think that might have been the Invalid Regiment. I think was issued British coats without dyeing, in their original. And then through the war, you had Foreman's Regiment wearing British coats. You had I think it was there was an additional regiment from Connecticut. I think it was Webb's wearing red coats, and at least one cavalry regiment wore red coats and put hunting shirts over them to conceal the red. So yeah, the Continental Army was a mess. It was effective. It was effective in a lot of ways, but logistically it was a mess. It really was.
That changed as time went on, correct?
It did, yeah, and also it also depended on what state. The Massachusetts, Connecticut troops were very well supplied, especially with clothing. But some states weren't always able to support their troops with clothing, and the Continental Clothier, pretty much through the war, the Continental Clothier system got a little bit better, but they still relied a lot on France for materials and even some made-up coats. So again, it often depended on what state the unit came from at least how well clothed they were. The food supply system was basically continental, so when one unit starved, they pretty much all starved if they were in one location. And that's another thing. It also depends where they were stationed too. So yeah, that's what makes it so interesting and such a complicated organization.
It sounds like it's trying to herd cats in terms of research. Just the idea of all the reorganization sounds like an absolute nightmare to keep track of anybody.
Oh yeah. If you just looked at the Virginia line alone, when they melded regiments together in 1778, then they did it again in 1779, and then they had sent those conjoined regiments down south, but then they also had what they called Virginia detachments, which were basically new regiments. Connecticut and Massachusetts and New York, to some extent, are probably the most understandable. But once you get to the other states, New Jersey's pretty understandable too. But some of the other states can be pretty messy. They really can, trying to understand the organization. And then, of course, when you reduce regiments, then you also have extra officers. So, the junior officers were let go, which means you probably had at least more experienced officers. They weren't always better officers, because we know that there were some officers in the Army that were not exactly they might have been good in the field or good in action, but when it came to actually handling their regiment, they probably were not that good for the men and for morale and all that. But yeah.
So since you brought up officers, now that I'm thinking about it, in the British Army, largely there's a purchasing system, an aristocracy system that kind of dictates where your stature is in the British Army or in other European armies. Without that in America, how are American officers gaining their position? Because West Point is not a thing. Well, it's not a military academy yet.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. At first, it basically started with militia colonels taking charge of regiments. Well, at first they were probably appointed by the locale, by the county or the town they came from. Eventually, they were commissioned by the province that they belonged to. But eventually, once it became a Continental Army, they had to receive Continental commissions. So then they had to work out the seniority in the standing state regiments when they went into Continental service, and that was always. And then, once you got your Continental commission, then it depended on, what date it was, whether you were senior, and there were always arguments about that. But yeah, you had to be commissioned, you had to be appointed, basically.
But there wasn't. Could anybody become commissioned, or was it a who you know?
It was largely a who you know thing. New England is very notorious, especially early war, for having basically plebeian or maybe even proletariat colonels or field officers. I mean, one of the issues was one colonel was taken to task in 1775 or maybe 1776 for making shoes for his men, because he had been a shoemaker before he went into the army, and that was looked down upon because an officer was a gentleman. You didn't do those kind of things. The further south you went, the more, you can't always say gentleman, but at least you were more gentry, or at least you were of a certain class. So yeah, and it was basically on who you knew, which probably is how you got your role in the militia too.
I'm sure you've encountered kind of a popular history understanding of the American Army and what it was during the American Revolution. If there was something that you could get every school student to understand about the American Army during this time period, what would it be?
Well, if you want a history of the Continental Army, you should look at Robert Wright's The Continental Army, which is not perfect, but he's living in Florida now, and he's actually working on a second edition. But that's not exactly for school children. I'll give you two, because school children is a relatively large term. If you want to understand
children of all ages, maybe.
Yeah, if you want to understand the experience of Continental soldiers, of course you want to read Joseph Plum Martin. Plum Private Yankee Doodle. It's under other titles. If you want to understand about the Army, then you want to read Charles Royster's Revolutionary People at War, because that actually is about the Continental Army from beginning to end and how it changed. It's not exactly. It's not an organizational description of the Army. It's more of how it changed as far as, you know, the men's attitudes, society's attitudes towards the Army. But it's an excellent read. So, you know, with caveats, I'd have to suggest those three.
That's fantastic. Is there anything that we didn't cover, John, that you would like to tell the world about the Continental Army, or its creation, or anything along those lines?
Well, one thing, and it's something I've just got into in the past, I guess 10 years, I think, is African American but also Native American participation in the Army, because American Indians did serve in Continental regiments, and of course so did black soldiers, both free and enslaved. There were slave soldiers in the Army, and the thing is, the people who know about the black soldiers who served in the Continental Army, they think that in 1776 that they threw all the black soldiers out of the Army because there are orders to that effect. Basically, what that whole 1775 experience was a paper exercise on whether they should keep black soldiers in the Army. I think they may have thrown out some slave soldiers at that point, but black soldiers basically served through that whole period. So in essence, black soldiers served in the Continental Army, probably about 7% of the Army, maybe getting up to maybe close to 10% of the Army later in the war. But they served from April 1775, because there were black militiamen on that day, all the way to 1783, pretty much with no halt. I mean, and they were, with one exception, and that was the segregated First Rhode Island Regiment. With that exception, they were integrated into the Army, so they served alongside their white and Indian comrades. My one thing I would like to know about the Army is, in 1778 there was a return of 15 brigades of the Army. It was called Return of the Negroes in the Army, but that return doesn't include South Carolina and Georgia or New Jersey. And I wish I could know what the number, wish there were similar returns at other periods of the war, so I could find out. And also, that return is Return of the Negroes in the Army. And Negro, there's actually an article coming about, or a study coming out on that. That return, I'm convinced, shows only the slave soldiers in the Army. So at that point, there were 755 slave soldiers in the Army, enough to form two small regiments, pretty much the size of any other regiments in the Army. And we don't know how many free soldiers were in the Army at that time. So people should know that that blacks and Indians did serve in the Army, in the Continental Army, through the entire war.
And John, you were being very modest with your book recommendation, so I'll do your PR for you and say that I would also very much recommend your book, They Were Good Soldiers, which I had the privilege to work with you on when I was with Hellion, which is an excellent read for anybody that wants to go into that topic in more detail.
Well, thank you, and that's the book where I tried to before each. I broke it down by state, and before at the beginning of each state chapter, I basically laid out the organization changes for each state. And I have it online. I did just recently change it for New York, because New York is a little bit difficult to understand. But thank you. I appreciate that. I really appreciate that.
So at this point, I think we're ready for our Murmurs in the Camp section, and we'll kind of go around the horn, and everybody can chime in. And our question for today is, what Continental Army impressions are you most excited about for the 250th? John, would you like to start for us?
Sure. And this is based on discussions with some people, and I may or may not be able to take part. I don't know, but and I hope I get the number of the regiment correctly. I think it's the 26th Continental Regiment. I think it's Bradley's.
Baldwin's,
and
but yes.
There is, Baldwin's, yeah. And there is talk of doing Baldwin's, and instead of what was generally thought, that there were only a few grenadiers in the regiment, the entire regiment was grenadiers. So so in other words, the entire regiment would be able to wear the grenadier caps, cloth grenadier cap. Plus, my cousin Matt White has found lost lists, clothing lists or lists of clothing and equipment that was lost at Fort Lee from the regiment. So he found out that the men actually carried bounty coats from the previous year. So they weren't so there's, you can have the regimental, you can have the bounty coat, and since bounty coats and regimentals were lost, you could probably wear either or for an impression post Fort Lee, and some grenadier caps for some men could wear a mix of caps, grenadier caps and other caps. But that's the unit that I'm most look forward to seeing it come off. It sounds pretty awesome.
All right, Alex, you want to go?
Yeah,
go
I
next?
think John stole mine, so I love that. But no, it's interesting, John. We're also in the Midwest, kind of talking with Matt and Matt Kay up at Fort Ticonderoga and Asher Lurie about doing Lomi Baldwin's 26th. So it's a very cool impression, and one that I'm excited to see get some attention during the 76 anniversaries. I would also say on a sort of later war perspective, I'm excited to see folks pay attention to the sort of Maryland and Delaware troops who are fighting in the Southern Campaign. They're a unit that gets a lot of attention in kind of popular histories of the war. I think there's, and I kind of going to be spiky here, so forgive me for that, but there's kind of a bad popular history of the Maryland troops in the Continental Army. But kind of doing that well. I've been doing some reading on the social history and like the social background of some of these guys, some of whom, as John, you reminded us at the recent Resolution Conference a few years back, are almost draftees into the Continental Army in the later part of the war. It's a fascinating impression, and one that doesn't always get maybe the type of attention that you would hope for. So I'm looking forward to seeing that addressed as we get closer to, what would it be, 2031? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to do the Battle of Cowpens. Actually, it was just about 2 months before COVID hit, and I did it with Green's Army portraying the Delawares, and it's amazing to do a really good late war impression, and I'm talking 1781 especially, but even 1782. I mean, with the war in the South, or war in South Carolina. But no, I agree with you. Until I heard of the Baldwin's impression, that would have been my answer, to see good impressions of late war Continentals in the South.
Awesome. Now, Andrew, do you have an answer to this question? I guess we could open up to favorite impression for the 250th, but all sides, if we want to do that.
Well, no, I was just thinking as you're talking. I mean, I'm not hugely plugged into the AWR reenactment scene, so if there is a new project that I don't know about, apologies to anybody involved. I've only ever seen a handful of people doing the Continentals on this side of the water. When there's an AWR event, the opposition typically are your generic militia, Minuteman, anybody in civilian clothes with a gun. So I mean, at the most basic level, it would be great. I know there's a French unit starting up. Obviously, there's been new British units, as you would imagine. I've seen a loyalist unit on this side of the water. I may well not know about it, as I say, because I'm not plugged into that. But yeah, at the most basic level, I'd love to see a Continental Army unit in the UK. Simple as that.
Could I give a fantasy unit?
Sure.
I mean, it's only fantasy. I very much doubt that it would come off, but I could hope for it. Would be to see a 1782 recreation of the Black Dragoons, which was a 50 to 60 man Black Cavalry regiment, or Black Cavalry company of escaped slaves, pretty much commanded by blacks. I think they had maybe one or two white officers. And that unit was retrained or trained along with the rest of the British cavalry, but I think by the commander of the King's American Dragoons. when he was waylaid in South Carolina. So they were trained alongside with the rest of the British Cavalry or Loyalist Cavalry. And like I said, I don't think it's going to be pulled off, but love to see it. Really would.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Wow. As much as I agree with both of you, I'm not going to repeat the answers that have already been given, but I'm excited to see the German regiment. They're doing a new coat project, and so hopefully within the next year or so, everybody's going to be in new coats, and that'll be really, really exciting. In my opinion, I think they're one of, if we want to call them mainstream units, if that's the category we'll give them, they're a very good mainstream unit, and it'll be great to see them all get their coats all together and fields all together like that. That'll be really, really fun. And so that would be my answer. But of course, doing the Maryland, Delaware troops and doing the Grenadiers as well, those are all things that I really, really am excited to see. But John, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. And hopefully we can have you on again at another point to cover some of the other topics you're researching. I think that'd be a really, really great time.
That'd be awesome.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend and leave us a review. It really helps, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford, produced by Lee Gugino. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.